This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. This is Ground Control to Major Brad. Brad, what's going on? How are you?
I'm okay. I feel a little
under pressure.
The lyrics. I feel a little under pressure.
You feel a little under pressure. Okay.
I was low, but I'm not anymore.
And today we could be heroes.
Yeah.
Forever and ever on the Art of Darkness podcast. If you haven't guessed it, today this is a core episode. I am helming. I am stepping through the door. I am Major Tom today, covering the singular David Bowie. I don't even know where to begin. Where does one start? It's been a while. I'm back in the saddle. We've had a great summer here in the Art of Darkness studios. Had a lot of fun. We had some good dark rooms. I've got my outline in front of me. Just buckle up. This is going to go for 3, 4, 5 hours. Who knows how long this is going to go? But
yeah, though everybody knows Bowie.
Dog, this is a poster, right? I mean, if you're following on YouTube, you can see I have the great Bowie from Low, the Low cover on my T-shirt. I don't normally do this on the pod. I'm a slobbering fan of David Bowie, and I have been for a long time. Right. I mean, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but one of the books that I'm referencing here is the fantastic oral history of David Bowie. It's David Bowie, The Oral History from Dylan Jones. And it is the most oral history of all oral histories.
Yeah.
David Bowie was a horny man. David Bowie makes the Nutman, makes Dan Baltic look like a peasant, dare I say, a sexual peasant. And that one's for you, Dan. But go on, Brett.
Well, I was just going to say, it does make sense to me. You have to be so horny to be David Bowie.
You have to be so horny to do. David Bowie was very, very, very sexual, and famously so. And there was a little bit of cynicism in it as well. He was definitely provoking and grabbing attention and trying it on. I think in one of these little bits from the oral biography, somebody's like, he was, and we'll cover it. I think it was one of the Warhol actresses or actors said David Bowie was a heterosexual man who wasn't afraid of gay sex. Like, that's how they describe him, but it's a million other, this oral biography is fantastic. By the way, it's one of the best books I've ever read. It is it's quite literally just names and comments about Bowie with Bowie periodically all through his life. Covering, and you get a complete picture of his life with this wonderful pastiche. And so, I mean, and it's just, you could open up any page of this book and it's fantastic. Like, I was doing my show prep just now and I opened it up and it's like, oh, here's where he met Paul McCartney. I bet that's interesting. Yes, it was. Yeah. All right. We are covering the life of the Starman himself, the singular Picasso of pop music, pop art, style, fashion, but the sexiest man alive for a period of time, most probably, and arguably the greatest performance artist of the 20th century. I think you could make a case for that. Oh, yeah. I've been tortured preparing this episode because, like, just now I just remembered, like, I forgot to include a link to the bit about, like, when he met Sinatra and hung out with, like, you know what I mean? Like, there's no possible way in a single episode that we could cover the entirety of David Bowie's life and career.
Of
It's just
course. Yeah.
impossible. So
Yeah.
and for the Bowie heads, like I know our friends on Rare Candy are just like hardcore Bowie people. For everybody listening to this, I welcome feedback, and we're going to do dark rooms with lots of people
Mm.
who are passionate about Bowie. You got something, you got a podcast of your own, or you're an artist of your own, reach out to us, artofdarkpod@gmail.com, hit us up. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, and I may leave out like one of your favorite Bowie stories.
Sure.
And if I do, just get in the Discord and chat about it. Artofdarkpod.com/Discord, or we'll cover it in the future on Dark Rooms. Bowie was just this like he was almost like a Zelig figure, right? Going from decade to decade to decade to decade. And like as a child, I associated with him with the 80s
Hmm.
personally.
Me
Partly
too.
because I existed in the 80s.
Hmm.
But the 80s were like not that he really for people who are older, it's the 70s. He was
Hmm.
David Bowie announced the 70s with Ziggy, right? And but
Hmm.
then also like then you're doing research on him and you go to like his profile on Spotify and it's like the number one tune is Under Pressure with Queen, which like announces the 80s. So like he's somehow
Mm.
there, to kick off the 70s, to kick off the 80s. Then in the 90s, he tours with Nine Inch Nails, and the
I
tour
remember
was
that.
not very well received. But like you read about how the tour, oh my God, it just goes on
Hmm.
and on and on. Um, so what I mean, well, I'll try to do my very best is what I'm
Yeah.
saying, and I hope everybody enjoys it. Brad, I'm getting ahead of things. Okay, here we go. What do you know? What do you know about David Bowie, Brad? What do you know
Yeah, I
about
mean,
David Bowie?
I don't know much about him like pre-career. I mean, he's an
Mm-hmm.
Englishman, but beyond that, I have no real idea. Upper class, lower class, working class. Couldn't tell you to be honest.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I know came like rocketing onto the scene in the I guess the late 60s with I think Space Odyssey or not Odyssey, Space Oddity was the first or at least one of the first things that really popped off for him. And then that just escalated through the 70s with these characters, Ziggy Stardust, Starman. And I am very interested to follow along. I know his career, he was a chameleon. So
Yeah.
it seemed like every album or every couple of albums, he's effectively, it's a different David Bowie, both music style and how he appeared and how the stage work was done and all of that. I couldn't tell you what happened when and all of that. To me, it's just a bunch of it's a bunch of different cool things he did and was. Um and then yeah, but a huge one of the most known names, one of the most uh sort of idiosyncratic individuals. Um Even before I ever really listened to his music, there was a kind of like, oh, that guy's for real. Like he's out there artistically with integrity, doing different stuff and it working. Um, and yeah, I mean the later years, like anybody, it seemed like you didn't hear from him as much, but he definitely became some kind of like elder statesman of rock and roll without ever really hanging it up. It didn't seem like. So I don't know, just the all out, rock and roll genius. I guess that's about all I know.
Absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
you nailed it. And I'm gonna that's great. And he's like
Yeah.
our guy all the way.
Mm,
Like
mm.
and what's so crazy is that he's like our guy for everybody. You know
Right.
how everybody he listens to Radiohead Creep and says,
Yeah.
"Oh, he just like me for real." Well, who's the
Yeah.
creep then, right?
Yeah.
Uh
Yeah.
Bowie's like king of the freaks, king of
Hmm.
the weirdos, king of the artists, king of the misfits, right? And
Hmm.
then we all look around and we go, well, wait a minute, we all feel like this,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so what do you do with that information? He's genuinely one of the most inspiring figures of the last 100 years.
Oh,
Artistically, just an absolute genius and very much into Nietzsche, very
oh,
much into
really? Okay.
Kerouac, very
Yeah.
much into Crowley. I mean, his
Hmm.
lyrics explicitly are talking about Crowley from like very early. He even says,
Wow.
trapped in wearing Crowley's uniform. I think he sings on one of the albums, and
Hmm.
Station to Station is explicitly fucking with the Kabbalah, and in the art, and the stations are the stations of the Kabbalah. He was playing with
Mhm.
some really serious,
That's cool.
seriously,
All
like,
right.
dark forces and things. There was one
I like
interview
it.
that I watched recently, and again, I'm not going to get every anecdote and every ad hoc little thing I say totally accurate, but that's part of the fun of David Bowie too. And he even played with that. Like, people would like send him articles they were getting ready to publish with purposely with misinformation to see if he would correct them. He never did.
Yeah.
And he
Really?
would let the myth. I mean, he knew he
Yeah.
was myth making. He knew he was creating this character. Like, David
Hmm.
Bowie doesn't even exist, and that
Hmm.
was David Bowie is a stage name, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you peel that onion back, and what finally do you arrive at? Um, but oh gosh, it was what were we just talking about? We were talking about there was an anecdote that I wanted to get over. Oh, it'll come back to me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so you know a fair amount, but I mean we're gonna cover so much in this
Yeah, I
episode.
would say I have like the average music listener knowledge about who he was. So this is going to be cool to learn a lot more.
Yeah, there's gonna be a lot to cover. Um, do you have a favorite David Bowie period?
Um, and it's really probably what my entry point was. I mean, I actually of the albums, and I certainly haven't listened to them with the depth that you have, and I haven't listened to all of them. But the most enjoyable one for me is actually Ziggy Stardust and Spiders from Mars. Yeah,
Banger. You can't go wrong
yeah,
with Ziggy. That's a
yeah.
banger. And we're
It's
going to cover like we're going to talk about Ziggy exhaustively. I just remembered.
mm,
So in this interview, it was something to the effect of actually it was an interview I read. Some woman is like, yeah, I'm not sure I'd want to meet him. He seems to me like he he's a wonderful generational performer, but he seems that he might play with black magic a bit. And David
mm.
Bowie sort of went, well, yes. It's yes. Like, it can be two things.
Yeah,
It's both
yeah,
things.
yeah.
Another little, and this gets into the thing that I have to do about the books, right? So we're using the oral history, exhaustively. I've got this great Bowie on Bowie book of
Cool.
interviews,
Mhm.
edited by Sean Egan. A lot of it is music journalism, which is just insufferable. The way that music journalism is written is just horrific. Uh, but there's some good stuff in here. And there's a quote from one of these, and I couldn't pinpoint it here just right at the beginning of my prep, but I remembered it, and it's something to the effect of, and I want you to remember this, Brad, because this is important.
Mm,
Bowie was playing with time.
mm.
Time was his subject. If there's one thing we think about when we think about David Bowie, it's important to think about time. And he was prophetic, and he was on the vanguard of numerous things, finance and music. We're going to come to
Oh,
this. He
really?
did something
Okay.
extraordinary. He essentially created the celebrity bond in the
Huh.
90s. He securitized his back catalog, right? Which sounds like, I don't know, like selling out or something, but it's not. Very
Mm.
interesting. He very famously, have you seen the interviews with him where he essentially kind of points where the internet is going?
Yes, I have seen that. Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Brilliantly insightful. I don't remember exactly what he said, but I remember being pretty impressed by his foresight.
In the 90s, you could tell that he was very online. Before
Mm,
most people were very online, just like we're very
mm,
online.
mm.
In one of these oral history bits, one of his musicians, and there's no way I'm going to be able to give credit to all of the musicians that worked with him over the years,
Sure.
but one of the musicians is like, he would always answer my emails right away. He must have loved his computer, which is very. So
Yeah,
Bowie, you have to imagine Bowie in his penthouse in New York in the 90s having like the highest speed internet
yeah.
possible, emailing Brian Eno in
Yeah.
1994, right? Like,
Right,
just
right, right,
online, and like
right.
understanding in 1994 that we're watching the birth of a new consciousness, right? Well,
Mm,
we're connecting to AOL, like Bowie
mhm.
is like already there. I like to
Yeah.
imagine that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But this quote is like, "You're a man." It's like and they're talking about his music. It's like you're a man from the year 2000, looking back on the 80s in the 70s, and that's
Okay,
one of the
yeah.
craziest things. And I challenge people, not now, listen to the end of this episode, but I challenge people to go and listen to my favorite Bowie record, Bowie Low, the I believe the middle record of the Berlin trilogy. It's the thing that's on my shirt here, the cover here. And I really dare you to listen to that from beginning to end, ideally on vinyl. All right. All right. I listen to it or on Spotify from beginning to end and tell me that that music is not out of time. It's out of time somehow. Like it
Mm,
sounds like
mm,
if somebody recorded something comparable to Bowie Low now today, we would laud them as visionary
mm,
geniuses
mm,
today
mm,
somehow, right? I don't know
mm,
what today's equivalent of Bowie Low would be, but it's timeless music. And in any
mm,
case, so let's keep that in
indeed.
mind as we give the biography of the Starman. All right.
Cool.
So I know some people get annoyed by our protracted intros, but I'm going to talk for like 4 more hours. All right. So the good stuff is coming. Hopefully, I've already given you some good stuff. I got to tease the After Dark that we're going to do. The After Dark
Yeah,
is
do it.
for Patreon and for Substack. If you subscribe to one or the other, you get the same behind the scenes content. You get the After Dark. After Dark is bonus content we give for every episode. We always dig in a little further, whether it's a core episode like this or a dark room. We do another 20, 30 minutes. This dark room is probably going to be quite long, or After Dark, excuse me, is going to be quite long. I got a lot to talk about. David Bowie like touches on everything, dude. He is the keystone. We're going to talk about burros,
All
right?
right.
We're
All
going to talk
right.
about Nina Simone, friend of the
Hmm.
pod, Nina Simone.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
They had a phone correspondence in the 70s where they
Oh,
would
interesting.
or a phone relationship where they would talk
Hmm.
for like 3 or 4 hours a night over the phone. Uh
Cool.
right, like we're going to talk about Iggy Pop, we're going to talk about Lou Reed. It just goes on and on. And we're going to talk about John Lennon.
Hey.
Did you know? Guess who was number two on Chapman's hit list behind John Lennon, Brad?
Well, I'm gonna guess David Bowie.
David Bowie. Chapman was
Yeah.
going
I did
to
not know that.
they think that Chapman was going to go after David
Oh,
Bowie too. So we're going to talk about all that stuff. But
cool.
on the After Dark, we're going to touch on. Uh, have you ever heard of Brian Eno's oblique strategies, Brad?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
at the beginning of the After Dark for Patreon for Substack after the core episode here, I'm gonna throw in a bleak strategy and then I'm gonna random online. I'm gonna pick one and then I'm gonna let that inform how I do the After Dark. So it's gonna be a
Ah,
very interactive, very Brian
cool.
Eno, David Bowie type After Dark. We're
Cool.
gonna talk about more about Iggy Pop, Brian Eno, and because I gotta throw in some like extra special dark shit for the After Dark, we are gonna talk about the uh shall we say, uh, adolescent groupies that were going
Mm,
around
okay.
in the
Okay.
70s, and which um, there were some Guardian articles written about this, shall
Yeah,
we say.
let's say
In
there were some Guardian
there,
articles written.
let's
Okay.
just say there was a Guardian article written. Uh,
Yeah.
David Bowie now today he'd be canceled, but it's this
Mm,
weird thing in the 70s where and some of the girls will even be like, no, that was what we were doing. Like, I know this is what it was. So we're going to talk about that on the After
okay.
Dark. All
Okay.
right. I don't want to, we're not doing this pod to run roughshod over anybody's reputation.
No.
It's already out there online. If that's a line you can't cross, then I'm sorry you can't listen to David Bowie's music, I suppose. But you know, and I'm not gonna run cover for the behavior. I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
he was, sort of disavow, sort of
Yeah.
apologetic about it as he went on, as you should be. But once we get into this, we're going to see like his first wedding. They were nearly late for his wedding to Angie because they were having a threesome like, the night before with a friend of
Okay.
theirs. Okay,
Okay.
right. They're gonna get me to the church on time as a modern love. I think it was the lyric.
Yeah.
So okay. And of course, drugs were a huge problem for him. We'll
Mm.
cover most of that stuff on the main episode, and then finally on the After Dark, I'm going to talk about David Bowie in Twin Peaks. You're aware that
All
he's in
right,
Twin
cool.
Peaks, right, Brad?
Yeah, I forget. I always forget that, but yes, I do know that. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and he was supposed to make a major return in The Return, but
Oh,
instead, obviously he didn't make it 25
hmm
years. So like in The Return, that role is played by a like a glowing bit of light and a teapot. Because
Okay. I mean, what are you gonna do?
because
You're gonna
yeah,
recast the guy that
right.
David Bowie was gonna play?
You're not gonna
Yeah.
recast David Bowie. No. Okay.
Mm.
All right. Well, let's get into the bio proper.
Yeah.
Any other housekeeping before we start, Brad? Just live show
Oh,
in October, October
yeah.
26th. Yeah,
Yep.
tell people
Yep.
about it.
Live show October 26th, Detroit, Michigan, Planet Ant Theater. Actually, for my Detroit friends, you know that that's in Hamtramck, but it's the Detroit area. If you're in town, come out. It's gonna be a great time. We're gonna wear costumes. We're gonna have special guests do a little performance for us. We're going to hang out. We're gonna have a couple drinks if that's your thing, and we're gonna tell the story of the uncanny death of Harry Houdini. It's gonna be a great time.
Harry Houdini, October 26th. Go to artofdarkpod.com. Tickets are on
Yeah.
sale. We're doing
The
my
tickets
play
at the
in.
just at the top.
Mhm.
Sorry, just at the banner. Just click get tickets and then do it, and we'll see you.
Yes. Yes, be there. Wear a costume. And
Yeah.
then we're doing my play moderation, moderationplay.com here in St. Paul in October at the Hive, October 3rd to
Awesome.
the 13th. Get some tickets. Go see live theater. If you don't go see my play, go see somebody else's play. But please consider coming to my play at
Yes.
the Hive in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Do it.
Badmouth Theater Company, badmouthtc.com, moderationplay.com. It's going to be cool. We got into the space. I've got a great team of people working on that. It is going to be
Very
fun.
exciting.
I was actually using some of David Bowie's music videos because we're going to do some projection, and I was using
Okay.
"Ashes to Ashes," the great music video, which we're going to talk about. That's one of the things that he influenced was the music video in a major
Sure.
way. "Ashes to
Mm.
Ashes" was a big deal. And
Mm.
we'll
Okay.
cover it. All right. Yeah, and Ashes to Ashes is the sequel to Space Oddity, right? So there's this
Oh,
major
okay.
Tom story arc that he carries through his career. It's pretty thin, but at the very end, right, the final music video in with Black Star, there's a dead body on some planet,
Mm.
a skeleton encrusted in jewels, and they take I think his skull back to be worshipped by this cult of women in that last video, and
Huh.
pretty common knowledge that that's Major Tom. All
Okay.
right,
Okay.
okay.
Okay. I didn't know about this. Cool.
Oh yeah, there's so much stuff going on. The lore is deep. Bowie lore
Yeah.
is deep.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, and thankfully we're getting so many teal bucks. We're able to cover it all. Apparently. Oh man, what a good time. Um, let's do this thing. Oh man, I can't wait. I've been having such a fun time. What a great excuse to go back and listen to the back catalog from the beginning too.
Sure.
Just incredible. All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
David Robert Jones, known to the world as David Bowie, was born on the 8th of January, Elvis's birthday, if I'm
Hmm.
not mistaken. Let me just double check. I want to make sure. 8th of January, 1947 in Brixton, London. Brad, you have never been to London. You've never been to Brixton.
No.
We got to go. We got to do Art of
Mm.
Darkness live in London. I can tell you, Brixton is you hear the Clash song, Guns of Brixton.
Mm.
I
Hmm.
think that's the Clash song, Guns of Brixton. Um, when I lived over there and did theater over there, we lived right next to Brixton in Camberwell. Brixton is the sort of famously the Jamaican, sort
Ah,
of
okay.
Jamaican, I guess, expatriates, sort of live in that area. And it's on the south side of the Thames, and yeah, worth visiting if
Hmm.
you're ever over in London. Maybe one day we'll go, Brad.
Hmm.
He was the son of Margaret Mary Peggy Burns. My mother was named Margaret and was a Peggy. That's fun. A waitress. Uh, and Haywood Stenton John Jones, a promotions officer for the children's charity Barnardo's. Bowie's upbringing was modest. His family lived at 40 Stansfield Road near Brixton, a working class area of South London. All right, and I've got a little bit about his parents. Oh, this is the third book, the biography, Bowie, the biography from Wendy Lee. And I'm just going to read a little bit about his family background here. Da, da, da. Long after David's birth at 40 Stansfield Road, a three-storied terrace house, mythology had it that the midwife who delivered him swooned about his knowing eyes. Oh, and we haven't talked about his unusual eyes yet, have we? He was not
No.
born with that, with the one eye wonky. We'll cover
Hmm.
about why, and insisted that the newborn baby had been here before. The baby, David's otherworldliness, is the first of the many myths attached to David Bowie, perhaps by his father, John Haywood Jones, a seasoned PR man who devoted his considerable talents to raising David's profile, or by subsequent publicists, or possibly by David himself, always his own best publicist, willing to spin untruths into truths, all in quest of lending luster to his image and his career. But even if the midwife's reaction was contrived and merely a publicity ploy, the truth is that David's birth did have an otherworldly significance to it, one that would become clear only a few months before his 10th birthday, when Elvis Presley burst onto the scene with Heartbreak Hotel and blue suede shoes, thus becoming the world's first rock idol whose megawatt rock god appeal has never waned. David Bowie was born on the 8th of January, Elvis Presley's 12th birthday. David's mother, Peggy, no mean judge of male charisma, was overcome when Elvis flooded the radio with hits, and she viewed the fact that David shared his birthday as a positive omen. David would say, "She never let me forget it. She was enthralled by the idea. Honey, you share the birthday with the king. You gotta, um, yeah." And there's a little bit about Elvis later, but in any case, let's read a little bit about his parents. David may have cloaked himself in a mystical, magical, otherworldly image on his rise to stardom, but the reality is that his father came from solid Yorkshire stock, and it is likely that David inherited his financial savvy from him, which we're going to talk about later. There was a period where he got robbed, though, by his
Mm,
management. It's funny. My favorite Bowie era is like his psychologically darkest era. It's when he was,
mm,
praising Hitler and calling, saying we need a fascist dictator in England, and he was the thin white duke, and then he goes into the Berlin period and gets clean. That's my favorite Bowie period, all the way
mm.
from like station to station through to um, the Berlin stuff. That's just my favorite. But prior to recording this, though, and to researching this, I had more of a distance between Ziggy and the station to station stuff. It's like a 5 year period. Like,
Yeah.
dude, he was prolific.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's crazy. Of all the people who followed on the Beatles, he's the one who took the promise of what the Beatles were doing
Mm.
and carried it forward. For
That
that
makes sense.
alone, if he
Yeah.
if he did nothing other than that and had only made like 5 albums in the 70s, we'd still be singing his
Yeah.
name.
Yeah,
But he
for
did
sure.
so much more than that, which
Mm.
is just wild. All right. Born in Doncaster, South Yorkshire, and brought up in Tadcaster. These names sound fake. Tadcaster. It sounds like a knockoff guitar. You get it, Guitar Center.
Yeah.
I can't afford
No,
well,
yeah.
I'll pick up the Tadcaster, I
Yeah.
guess.
Or a tad
Yeah.
or a Tadcast is like it's a podcast, but it like doesn't work on Spotify or Apple or anything. It's on like some, you know.
Right, right. That's where all the teal bucks are going.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Tadcaster. That's the one that the divorced dad gets for his son, and the son's kind of sad about it, but he's gotta
Just listening
gotta
to
be
like
happy.
Scott
Mm.
Baio interviewing people or something, just like
I'll tell you, I had the worst experience doing this, man. Last night I was in bed and I was just like listening to Bowie and I was all in Bowie stuff and my mind was being expanded. It really is like
mm,
tripping. Like once you get into his stuff, you're just like you're being taken on this psychedelic journey through time and
mm,
through musical concepts. He nobody's deconstructed pop music and put it back together better than David Bowie and his people. And then suddenly, like, on the Bird website on Twitter, occasionally you'll like swipe and a new video will pop up. by
Yeah.
mistake or whatever.
Hmm.
So I'm like deep into some Bowie stuff, and then I swipe, and it's Jimmy Buffett doing Margaritaville.
Very different vibe.
And listen, I
Very
know
different
there's a
vibe.
time for Margaritaville,
Hmm.
right? That you know what,
Hmm.
and that's fine. And I could see him playing the 3 or 4 chords that it takes to do that tune and having a great time.
Hmm.
And it's cutting to the crowd, but I'm like, get plug me back in to the Bowie stream of consciousness.
Hmm.
That's where I
Fair
want to
enough.
be. Anyway, um, all right. And this is about his father. Although he came from a working class background, his father sold shoes and boots, and his maternal grandfather was a foreman of a wood mill. Like some hero out of Charles Dickens, John rose in the world after his wealthy aunt sent him to British public/private in American terms school, where he was drilled in good manners, thus emerging with the veneer of an English gentleman to the manner born. David claimed that his father received the call to work with orphans in a dream, and John did go on to do all he could to help them by taking a job at the children's charity, Dr. Barnardo's Homes. He began working there in 1935 and continued until his death 34 years later.
Oh.
But saintly as John's work in his latter years might have been, and true to his son's propensity for ringing the changes in the most dramatic way possible, he had also lived out a wild, anarchic side in his youth. After inheriting a substantial sum of money when he was only 17 years old, he had bought a theater club and then a nightclub on Charlotte Street, London, which was patronized by boxers, wrestlers, and gangsters. Both failed dismally. So his father had this kind of entertainment side, the sort of seedy London
Mhm. Mm.
nightlife side. Before Peggy came into his life, John had married a cabaret performer known as Hilda, the Viennese nightingale. Ah, wunderbar, Hilda. But he was unfaithful to her with a nurse who gave birth to his daughter Annette, whom Hilda, clearly a remarkable woman, agreed to bring up as her own. In fact, when her marriage to John was spiraling downward, Hilda persuaded him to buy a house that Annette could one day inherit. The house was 40 Stansfield Road, and when David was born, Annette would help care for him. However, in 1956, Annette met and married an Egyptian engineer and moved to Cairo with him, became a Muslim, and coincidentally changed her name to Iman, which would be that was Bowie's
Yeah.
second wife, Iman,
Wow.
the Somalian supermodel. We'll
Mhm.
cover all that later. She last saw David when he was 15 years old, and she'd flown back to London for a visit. When David walked into the room, it all came flooding back. I threw open my arms to hug him, but he just flinched. I was hurt because I suddenly realized he cut me off in his mind the moment I walked out the front door when he was 9, Lynette said.
Wow.
So one thing about Bowie's household too, and I think this is Angie who said this, and Angie is a trip. And Bowie's first wife, Angie, a trip. Uh, it like Ziggy Stardust did not come from Bowie's mind alone. I can't remember what
Mhm.
record it's on. It might be, I think it's Ziggy, where he talks about 5 years, that's all we've got. And it's sort of this apocalyptic anthem. And there's a line where he says, I never knew I'd need so many people. Something like
Mm.
that. I'm gonna make sure
Mm.
I get that right. Um, Bowie, 5 years lyrics. But that's one thing that I've been struck with. That uh I never thought I'd need so many people.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
is like such an interesting, it's one of the reasons why I think this oral biography is so great, because you realize like David Bowie was was a group of people. Like it was an
Mm.
individual man, but he didn't exist in the vacuum of space, shall we say.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
we're still
Interesting.
talking about him, man. I've had I've had David Bowie visit me in my dreams, dude. Like
Yeah.
I have had, yeah, that dude, I really
Nice.
believe you could make like that guy was an actual wizard, like an
Mm.
actual real practicing wizard. And he would repeatedly say in interviews that he's not a musician. I'm not a musician.
Mm.
He would even say, I don't even play the instruments. Like for him, it was music was just the vehicle for a vehicle for his creativity, and
Right.
that might come off as like false modesty, but he means it. What he really meant was he's not like playing a Stradivarius up there, actually playing like musically like a real musician might, who's devoted to an instrument and who he
Hmm.
he even would say in an interview that he hated singing.
Oh, really?
He wished he could find somebody who could sing all of his songs for him. But he just
Interesting.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, and there was there's a moment where he takes over with the Ziggy stuff, and it was one of the great musical theater people of the period whose name escapes me. You would know it right away, but it was one of the guys who was a serious musical theater rock musical composer. What was his name? I think it was Andrew Lloyd Webber, maybe.
Oh wow. Okay.
Um, heard it and said, "What is this? He can't sing. I can't follow this. What is this guy doing?"
Yeah.
Um, and when you listen to David Bowie, there is a quality where you're like, is he
Oh,
like,
I've always come away with it not thinking, yeah, I mean, don't hate me, Bowie fans, but I never thought of him as a good singer in terms of
I,
somebody who has an incredible voice.
no, that's
Yeah.
not the point. He
No.
lives somewhere between Bob Dylan and the rest of us,
Hmm.
right? Like, I think
Hmm.
he's a better singer than I am,
Hmm. Oh,
right?
for
But
sure.
like,
Yeah. Yeah. And me
yeah,
too. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he was aware of that. The fact
Yeah.
that he even said, "I don't like it." It's like crazy. What are you, David Bowie? Like, come on. But there are moments when you listen to his music where you go, "Oh yeah, he's forcing this. There's
Mm.
effort here. It's not effortless." And he doesn't try to hide the fact that there's effort. Like, you listen to Heroes, which I now
Mhm.
believe is the greatest rock and roll song of all time.
Mm. Hmm.
One of the, let's say that,
Sure.
top three,
Yeah.
top five.
Why not?
Um, there's a moment where he's like, he turns it on and you just go, wow, this is like, it's not natural. He's not
Mm.
like some
Hmm.
bird. There's effort somehow. In any case,
Mm. Interesting.
um,
Okay. Okay.
yeah, yeah. Okay, a little more about his parents. After a chance meeting with Peggy Burns in her hometown of Tunbridge Wells, where she was working as a waitress at the Ritz Movie Theater Cafe, John Haywood Jones fell in love with her. Both strong individuals, they had David in 1947 when were in their mid 30s, and by the time he was 8 months old, they decided to marry, thus legitimizing him. Yeah, that helps.
Mhm.
They remained
Mhm.
married until John's death, and different as he, a placid and contemplative man, was from Peggy, who managed the unique feat of being alternately tempestuous and cold. He stayed the course with her. From his father, David got his love of reading. Even in his darkest drug days, he traveled with the world with trunks containing his vast library of books. One of us, one of us. He got his first taste of Hemingway from his father's Readers Book Club, which sent him a book a month, each of which David eagerly devoured. My father opened up my world because he taught me the habit of reading. I got so much information, so many of the things I wanted to do came from books. Another less salutary habit that David picked up from his father was chain smoking. And despite
Mhm.
undergoing hypnosis and aversion therapy to break the habit, for a great part of his life, he was unable to quit. John's favorite brand of cigarettes was Players, which he chain smoked, and David followed suit, making Players his own cigarette of choice. In later years, though, he switched to Marlboros, making sure that Coco, we're going to talk about later, but that's like his PA. He left her $2 million at the end of this.
Nice.
Yeah, so
Nice.
yeah, always carried a secret stash in her handbag just in case he ran out.
Now that's an assistant,
Listen,
you know?
we are still taking interns. What do we need? We need somebody who can do an IV drip,
Yeah.
who can prepare an outline,
Mhm.
carry
Yeah,
Marlboros. Mhm.
analog guys turn digital recordings into audio cassette.
Yes, and like could put cassettes out. Yes.
Yeah.
Artofdarkpod at
Yeah.
gmail.com. Another legacy from his father, according to David, was religious tolerance. My father was one of the few fathers I knew who had a lot of understanding of other religions. He encouraged me to become interested in other religions, he said. His tolerance was enhanced as well by the fact that his half brother, Terry, 9 years his senior, and his mother's son by her former lover, Isaac Rosenberg, was half Jewish.
Hmm.
I don't know if you can be half Jewish or I don't know. In any
Yeah.
case, half,
Yeah.
that's what the book says, half Jewish. And
And
Terry is
so
going to,
so that makes David Bowie like step Jewish. How's that? How's that? I can't do the math.
Brad does the Twitter account if you want to harass Brad. Step Jewish. Oh my, oy
That's kind of
vey.
a thing, right?
I don't think so.
No? Okay.
I really don't think it is, Brad. Um, that's really funny. Uh, Terry's going to figure really, really heavily in this narrative because there is like an key to understanding David Bowie and his career and what he was doing relates to his family's uh, struggles with mental illness. and
Mm.
his brother Terry Wood was schizophrenic. All right.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And so now you have to imagine, I mean, and if you have a family with any of that, um, it haunts the family.
Hmm.
I have schizophrenia in my family, and it creates a bit of uh, how to say this? It puts a ticking bomb under the table because you're sort of going, is this going to pop up?
Right.
It's probably similar with like alcoholism, for example, where
Hmm.
you have an alcoholic relative, they have a child, the
Hmm.
children are coming of age. It Everybody who has anything like that in the family knows that it feels like a ticking time bomb, and you just wonder if it's going to go off or not. And I think
Yeah.
that weighed heavily on Bowie. Okay. All right, a little more about Peggy. An adventurous and liberated woman, Peggy was the daughter of Jimmy Burns, a professional soldier of Irish descent who fought with distinction during the First World War. However, when he returned home to England virtually penniless, he resorted to what he did best, playing the clarinet in the streets of Tunbridge Wells as passerby threw coins into his hat in appreciation. Music was a Burns family passion, and all six of Jimmy's children played an instrument. When David was a little boy, every Sunday during lunch, he and his parents would listen to the BBC Light program Family Favorites together. Peggy's most beloved song was "Oh for the Wings of a Dove," sung by soprano boy singer Ernest Lowe, or Lau, and she would sing along with him, transported. Her voice would soar in ambitious unison, effortlessly matching Ernest note for note as she delivered the gravy boat to the table, said David, who went on to remember that his mother told him, all our family could sing. We couldn't do much else, but we all loved music. It was thought I'd have a career in music at one time. Little more. Apart from sharing her son's musical talent, he and Peggy had something else in common. Throughout her life, Peggy composed poems, lush, introspective poems, which, even though she left school at 14, were quite literate. In addition to writing poetry like John, she also read a great deal. Sometimes it seemed to visitors that she was so involved in whatever book she was reading that it was as if she were alone in the room and David wasn't there at all. Terminally self involved, Peggy didn't bother herself with encouraging David's burgeoning artistic talents. A compliment from her was very hard to come by. I would get my paints out, and all she would say was, I hope you're not going to make a mess, David remembered. Um, yeah, and this is very important. There was no sign of affection at any time, one of the childhood friends confirmed. It was a very cold household. She'd feed him, clothe him, do all the mother's things, but there was no cuddling. Peggy's lack of warmth toward David would take its toll on his emotions for her, so that when he grew up and left home, he would virtually sever contact with her and his family. Uh, Here's a little more. This is his mother's younger sister. David started out as a fun-loving, beautiful little child, but he grew up in a cold atmosphere, and by the time he was 5, he was extremely quiet and serious. I remember David coming home from school when he was 14, upset by something that had happened that day. He ran upstairs and threw himself onto his bed, sobbing his heart out. I asked Peggy if she was going to see what was wrong. She went up, but being such an unemotional person, she was unable to give him a hug or a cuddle to make him feel better. David turned to her and said quietly, You know, Mama, sometimes I think you hate me. So,
Mm.
uh,
Wow.
and there's a little bit more here about one of the aunts. Although Peggy did do the requisite amount of cooking and cleaning and wash David's clothes into his teens, her deep-seated remoteness, her strangeness, her inability to relate closely to David are highly likely to have been a slight manifestation of the schizophrenia from which her sisters, Una, Nora, and Vivian, also suffered. Schizophrenic.
Whoa.
Three schizophrenic aunts. For as much
Wow.
as David might try and joke about it, cracking of his family, most of them are nutty, just out of or going into an institution. The reality was dark and serious. In September of 1950, Una was sent to a mental hospital, Park Pruitt, where she was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. She was thereafter subjected to archaic treatments for the condition and died in her 30s. Vivian suffered from schizophrenia. Nora was also hospitalized, diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis, and, most horrifying of all, underwent a lobotomy.
Mm.
Then there was Terry, David's half brother, whom David idolized, but who would also be felled by the family curse of schizophrenia. This isn't like one cousin. This is
Right.
auntie, 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 brother. Oh, God,
Wow. It's right there.
Lord. Yeah, and schizophrenia tends to appear in later in life. So again, it's that
Yeah, it's
bomb
like a
under the table.
post-puberty thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's yeah. It was inevitable then that David would grow up haunted by the specter of mental illness and petrified of losing his wits. He told me so quite often and quite clearly. His first wife, Angie, confided. He told me about the
Mm.
insanity that ran through his family and that it scared him. Model Winona Williams, who had a 2 year relationship with him and in the early 70s, said, "There's a lot of madness in my family," he told a biographer who proceeded to suggest to him that he was merely talking about eccentricity. No, madness, real fucking madness. David shot back. Like, you get into a conversation, yeah, my family's nuts.
Mhm.
No, they can't. No, no. They're
No.
like, no, my aunt had a lobotomy.
Right,
like,
right. Yeah, they're
like,
going into institutions, then yeah. It's different.
yeah, yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah, David shot back. It worried me sometimes because I don't know whether it's in my genes or I'll end up that way too. And if I'll end up that way too, that's intense. And his music and his creativity was, as cliche as this is now, therapeutic and part of
Sure.
him coping with this stuff. David's salvation would prove to be his love of reading. Let's go.
All right. All
Which led
right.
him to Artie Lang's seminal reappraisal of schizophrenia, The Divided Self, published when David was 13, and which became one of his all-time favorite books. In it, Lang wrote, "It is the thesis of this study that schizophrenia is a possible outcome of a more than usual difficulty in being a whole person with the other and with not sharing the common sense, that is, the community sense, way of experiencing oneself in the world." Or, put it more simply, Lang also said, insanity, a perfectly rational adjustment to an insane world. All right. That
Yeah.
book was a sensation at the time, and that was the first bulwark against David's fear of inheriting his family's insanity. The second was his ability to submerge his fear in his lyrics and thus disarm it.
Mm.
And here's one of his very first memories. Um, let's see, a quintessential moment of his childhood. The very first memory I have is of being left in my pram in the hallway of 40 Stansfield Road facing the stairs. It seemed to be a very, very long time, and I was very scared of the stairs. They were dark and shadowy, he recalled.
Mm.
All right.
Mhm.
Uh, then I'm gonna move on in the bio, but this is the next chapter in this book. And again, I'm reading Wendy Lee's the biography, Bowie. When David was about 3 years old, his mother caught him putting on makeup for the first time. Not
Oh, interesting.
hers. Yeah. And that's another thing we've sort of haven't mentioned. He was like the gender bending, he was the OG gender bending mainstream icon. Like the
Mm.
Beatles, long hair was gender, but they
Yeah.
kind of cracked the egg. Bowie made the omelet.
Mm.
All right. Um, I just made that up. That's a
Yeah,
metaphor.
nice. Nice.
Sweet. Um,
Subscribe at
uh,
patreon.com/OurDarkPod, and you too can make metaphors.
there'll be more metaphors behind the paywall, puns and metaphors. Um, it wasn't her makeup, but makeup belonging to the tenants in the apartment upstairs, lipstick, eyeliner, and face powder, which he daubed all over his face. When I finally found him, he looked for all the world like a clown. Peggy Jones remembered in 1986. Shocked and amused, she rounded on David and told him in no uncertain terms that he shouldn't use makeup. If that edict had been handed down to him by his father, whom he idolized and whose calm temperament he appeared to have inherited, he might have accepted it. Instead, David said somewhat reproachfully, "But you do, mommy." All right.
Mhm.
Yeah. And a few years later, she would back down and encourage his tendency toward theatricality. Uh, and
Wait,
after
was
she,
this at? Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, no,
no,
no,
no,
no. Never mind.
no,
I was
after
gonna say,
she,
is that after he was a millionaire? But she wasn't
no,
really
no,
around for
no,
that.
no, no. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, this was just a few years later. After she
Yeah.
sewed David a robe and headdress, and his father made him a crook for his role as a shepherd in the nativity play put on by Stockwell Infant School, which he first attended when he was almost 5. Peggy observed how much he loved dressing up. It was then that we realized that there was something in David. All right. That realization was compounded by his reactions when he listened to the radio, in particular to American entertainer Danny Kaye's Inchworm. He would tell everyone to be quiet and listen and then fling himself about to the music, said Peggy, adding, "In those days, we thought he might become a ballet dancer." Um, yeah. Peggy's sister Pat sniped, he was a vain child, and he always tried to look different. Clearly irritated by David's childish vanity, Pat targeted his hair. He always liked to comb it his way, forward with a coif by his ear. If you combed it, he always had to do it again himself. He looked at himself a lot in the mirror, she said. Um, he loved rock and roll. When he in a later interview he would say, I think one of the early, it was like Chuck Berry or one of the early rock and rollers. He was like, it was like hearing the voice of God, is what he
Mm.
said. And he said, again in a later interview, he couldn't even understand the lyrics, but the fact that it made him feel the way he did, despite the lyrics being this American gibberish that he couldn't make sense of, he knew there was something there. Um, this is fun. They went to meet the Queen um, at an agricultural show, right? That the new Queen and Prince Philip were attending. David managed to elude the adults with him and end up right in front of the Queen, who looked down at him and said in the kindest tones possible, "Oh, hello, little boy." I love that. I'm doing my best, Elizabeth. When a
Sounded just
local
like her. Nailed it.
That nailed it. When a local photographer immortalized the moment. Consequently, David made his debut in the media by appearing on the first page of a Yorkshire newspaper, which, according to him, ran the picture of him and the Queen looking down at the little boy, slightly bemused. Sadly, that picture has proved to be untraceable. If you can find that picture of David Bowie and the Queen, let us know.
Oh yeah,
And
that's a
yeah,
big one.
Yo, that's another thing about this episode, dude. There is nobody that more ink has been spilled on. Covering
Mm.
David Bowie is so gnarly because you'll take one of his lesser known albums and it will
Mhm.
be the Wikipedia will be like the Wikipedia of an entire life of some other not minor figure.
I
Like
know. I was
for an
I just
album.
clicked on I was just scrolling through the discography here in the background. I clicked on Hours, which was an album I wasn't even aware of. And you're looking like, oh, it sold 1 million copies. Like I've literally never heard of it until just right now.
Yeah.
So yeah.
He's one of the best selling artists of all time. Yeah, for
Mm,
sure. And it's just like one album there. Okay.
hmm
And it just, yeah, and they'll break down this song is inspired by that and this is by that. It's just so well documented.
hmm
I don't really know how it got to be that way. I think it may have something to do with the fact that he worked with other musicians. And so even though he would be like, he didn't have one consistent band, it wasn't David Bowie and the Spiders for the entire career.
Right.
So people could, people that were in his orbit and that collaborated with him, I assume were very vocal about their work with him. So biographers could piece together, okay, this is what was going, his rock historians, this is what was going on here.
Yeah.
That might be the case, right?
Right. Right. That makes
It's
sense.
not like the Beatles were, and the Beatles are voluminously covered as well, but it's not like
Mhm.
Bowie was a star chamber, five musicians and a producer. It would be different musicians, session musicians.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Makes sense.
All right. And back in London, when his father took him to see a Christmas pantomime at a local theater, little David slipped out of his seat in the stalls and ran backstage, where he positioned himself behind the curtain, drinking in all the activities, watching the stagehands, and, most important of all, the audience. And then, of course, there was the applause. Mesmerized by his first live show, David was equally enthralled by television. In early 50s Britain, owning a television, even in a black and white one, was a luxury. But John Jones, with his important job at Dr. Bernardo's, as well as his abiding interest in show business, didn't balk at getting one for the family. Almost immediately, it became clear to anyone visiting that David had commandeered the television. The choice of program the family watched depended on him. All right. Until 1955, when ITV, the independent television channel, was launched, British television consisted of just one channel, the BBC. Uh, the den mother herself, the
The
old
big
bitch,
British
the
what?
big British channel, which broadcast only in black and white, starting in the afternoon. With only one channel available, there were very few programs, particularly for children. David's favorite show, The Flower Pot Men, a children's
Yes.
program featuring the puppets Bill and Ben, the Flower Pot Men, and their sidekick Little Weed, was to
Mhm.
become the highlight of his day. Sounds
That's like
like a
yeah, I had a
SoundCloud rapper,
yeah, I had a friend named that in college, I think. We
Lil Weed
yeah.
from Orlando. He's one of those. This is callous, but he's one of those rappers that like you only hear about when he's been shot.
Yeah, that's right. And he's 17
Yeah,
somehow.
he's
Yeah.
17. He has like 50 million plays on SoundCloud, and he's dead now. Rest
Yeah.
in peace,
Shot shot in
Lil
shot in his BMW. Yeah.
Lil Weed. Oh, poor Lil Weed. Gone too soon. Um, the greatest mumble rapper who's ever lived, Lil Weed. Just rapping inside a bong. Just smoke everywhere. All right, a little more here. He also developed a fascination with the science fiction series The Quartermass Experiment, followed by Quartermass 2, but which his parents decided was far too adult for him.
Hmm.
Undeterred, his parents watched the program. His parents watched the program. David hid behind the sofa and watched wordlessly, from behind the
Hmm.
couch. He
Hmm.
really got into science fiction and UFOs and stuff. Like it was
Oh yeah, you
not.
can tell that for
Oh
sure.
yeah, the dude was. Dude, can you, and it's cool to know that he lived to see the dawn of podcasting as well. I wonder
Hmm.
if he probably was into some like podcasts, and I wonder if he listened to Art
Probably.
Bell. Probably listened to Art Bell. I mean, the dude, his interests were heterodox. He was all over
Yeah.
the place.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to be interesting, be interested, I will say.
Yeah, that's very true.
Uh,
Yeah.
he was undoubtedly his father's favorite, and poor Terry generally had to sit on the sidelines when John arrived home from work and recounted his day in detail to David, and just David. Even Peggy, as cold and remote as she was, nonetheless favored David over Terry. It's hard to be half child, and it can be tough.
Hmm.
Had like a step Jew too. That's tough.
Yeah.
Um, all right. When David was 6, his parents sold the house in Brixton, and after a year in Bickley outside Bromley in Kent, moved to Clarence Road, Bromley. Finally, in 1955, David and his family moved to 4 Plaistow Road, Sundridge Park, Bromley, a terraced house with 4 rooms, a kitchen, and an attic, where they would remain for 15 years. David's bedroom overlooked the back of a pub, but even though the noise of carousers could be deafening, especially on a Saturday night, he could always lose himself in his dreams and in reading. I was a kid that loved being in my room, reading books, and entertaining ideas. I lived a lot in my imagination. It was a real effort to become a social animal. Uh, when he was 10, he enrolled at Burnt Ash Primary School in Bromley, joined the church choir, and was popular with classmates who dubbed him a leader, not a follower, and he refused to take part in roughhousing with the other boys. I felt very protective toward him, said his neighbor Barry Jackson, who lived across the street from him. He was very small, and when all the boys gathered, telling rude jokes, David sat in the corner mostly, not at all impressed. Um, Rude jokes, here we go, might not have impressed him, but at the young age of 10, he was already aware of girls and claims to have fallen head over heels in love with one of them. She was the first girl in the class to get tits, he said succinctly. Clearly, he always remembered her and them. And clearly, I
And
always
now.
remembered her and them. I went out with her years later when we were about 18, but I fucked it up. On our second date, she found out that I'd been with another girl. I could not keep it zipped, he said.
Hmm.
All right, so he's already into girls.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
age 10.
it,
Precocious.
precocious and
Hmm.
horny. All right, this is the bit that I got to cover, and then I'll get back and we'll start to move forward here. But although David's thoughts may have started to stray toward girls when he was very young, those thoughts and anything else in his life were dwarfed by his rising passion for rock music, rock and roll. David, who is 8 years old, when Bill Haley and his Comets' Rock Around the Clock hit the top of the charts and swept Britain with its revolutionary sound aimed exclusively at teenagers. And young as he was, David was set on fire by Rock Around the Clock. As a result, he fixed his already considerable will on amassing a record collection. Fortunately for David, unlike most kids in Britain at that time, most of whom had to save up 6 shillings and 8 pence in order to buy a 45 of their chosen hit, he was in the privileged position of getting them for free, as his father, chief publicist at Dr. Bernardo's Homes, routinely brought him the latest records that well-wishers had donated to the charity. That's
Ah, okay.
real charity. Bring some records in, goes
For
right to
young
David
David
Bowie.
Bowie.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. That
Making the
reminds me of
world a
the
better place.
making the world a better place,
Yeah.
stealing from the charity to give to your own son. This guy he'd fit right in today's world of
Hmm.
NGOs. We last year we donated $50,000. What was your salary?
Yeah.
$780,000. Amazing, incredible grift. I
Amazing.
love it.
Yeah.
Um, but it reminds me of the Dylan story too about Bob Dylan down here in Dinkytown in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, where he was friends with somebody and like he disappeared to New York with this guy's records, and the guy was
Mm.
really pissed off. And then a few years later, he's like, "Yeah, I think Dylan needed those records more than I did."
Right.
It's like if somebody steals your shit, maybe they, I don't want to be, you don't want to, yeah, maybe they need it more. Maybe they need it more
Yeah,
than you.
it is
You
possible.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's particularly media. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll just leave it at that. Very interesting.
Mhm.
Okay. And when Little Richard, complete with gold lame suit glittering from top to toe with gold jewelry, broke into the hit parade with Tutti Frutti, banger. David was in seventh heaven when his father presented him with the disc. Little Richard became his idol, and David remained true to him as an adult. He would always cite him as one of his favorite artists. Little Richard and the other American singers whose discs John Jones gave David also provided him with his first taste of America, baby.
Yeah.
That far
Yeah.
off wonderland that seemed a million miles away from Britain. I had America mania when I was a kid, David recalled, adding, but I loved all the things that America rejects. It was black music. It was the beatnik poets. It was all the stuff that I thought was the true rebellious subversive side. What makes America great is its pioneer, independent spirit. From the time, and you gotta put him in time, post-war Britain, gray,
Mhm.
drab, rations, uh, socialism,
Mhm.
labor, minor strikes, uh, and here comes this like exuberant black music from across the pond, this faraway land.
Mm.
Uh,
Super
yeah,
exciting.
that
Yeah.
that celebrates the individual and individualism inside the context of a group performance.
Right.
Um,
Right.
Inspired by jazz, coming out of the blues, and it hits this little kid's ears over there.
Yeah.
Yeah. From the time, and he would, and Bowie was an honor. Bowie's an American. He was an honorary American for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, he was always an
We'll take him.
Englishman, but we'll take him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I
well,
don't know
I
if he
mean,
got a passport or not, but we'll
no,
take him.
we like a citizenship. I'm not even sure if he
Yeah.
did, but I'd have to look. But he
Yeah.
died in New York City. He was a New Yorker
Mm.
for sure. Bowie was a New Yorker. Um, from the time when he received his first Little Richard disc from his father, America became his fantasy home. And from then on, at night, he would often slide under the covers and listen to the American Forces Network radio station, playing the top 10 records in broadcasting plays based in Springtown, USA. I would put myself into the play in my head and be living there and drink sodas and drive a Cadillac and play sax in Little Richard's band and all that, he once said. Little Richard didn't just represent the advent of rock and roll in Britain or personify America for David, but as Richard also played the sax, David, who never did anything by halves, resolved to follow in his footsteps and those of Terry, who had always been a huge jazz fan and favored iconic saxophonist John Coltrane.
Mm.
Determined to learn to play the baritone sax, which I played terribly.
Okay. Okay.
It's a very big instrument, Brett.
Mm.
Um, I'm comfortable with that, but I just, it was hauling it around was a pain.
Yeah, sure.
David was not a little disappointed when his father gave him a white acrylic Grafton alto, not baritone sax. Alto and baritone are in the same key, though.
Mm.
Its tenor is in a different key. Still undeterred, he picked up the local telephone directory, found a number, and called renowned baritone sax player Ronnie Ross, who had performed with Woody Herman and other jazz greats. And better still, as far as David was concerned, lived just a few miles away from him in Orpington, Kent. Um, so yeah, he went and he started learning to play the saxophone, and he wanted lessons. Called this guy, said, "Hey, my name's David Jones. I'm 12 years old. I want to play saxophone." So Ronnie was taken aback by the request. His first instinct was to refuse, but somehow or other, David convinced him to meet. And when they did, he won the sax player over. David's Saturday morning lessons with Ronnie, which cost him the princely sum of £2 a lesson, lasted for 3 months, during which Ronnie was impressed by his pupil's diligence, persistence, and talent. And David, returning the compliment, judged Ronnie to be cool and always remembered him fondly. This is out of time, but I like this. Much later on, David recalled, when I was producing Lou Reed, We decided we needed a sax solo on the end of Walk on the Wild Side. I got the agent to book Ronnie Ross. And after Ronnie flawlessly completed his solo in one take, David, who rarely forgets anyone who has treated him well in the past, smiled and said, "Thanks, Ron. Should I come over to your house on Saturday morning?" I couldn't fucking believe don't fucking believe it, Ronnie Ross exclaimed when he discovered that David Bowie had once been David Jones, his talented pupil, the 12-year-old with so much love for the sax and so much ambition. That's
Hmm.
cool as hell. Like, I
Yeah.
call that guy,
Yeah.
I love that for David Bowie. All right,
Yeah.
so
Rad.
yeah, I'm trying to paint a picture of his childhood here.
Mhm.
So yeah, his early years were marked by a deep fascination with music and art. Yeah, we've already covered Terry Bowie, but I got to talk a little more about him. Bowie had an older half brother, Terry Burns, from Peggy's previous relationship. Terry would profoundly influence Bowie, introducing him to modern jazz, Buddhism, beat poetry, and the occult. Terry
Hmm.
gave Bowie On the Road,
Oh,
and
okay. Wow.
apparently On the Road cracked Bowie's little brain wide open. Mm.
Okay.
Future subject. We haven't done Kerouac yet, have we?
No. No.
I think
No.
that's
No.
a. think that might be a Brad episode.
Yeah, it'll probably be me. We'll get around to him, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, we're gonna
Yeah.
have to. All right, and of course Terry struggled with mental illness, and this would influence David too. He was always interested in the arts. His father was very supportive. Um, Bowie would say about Little Richard, "When I heard Little Richard, it was like waking up. My world exploded."
Hmm.
His passion for music grew stronger as a teenager. It's interesting how the passion for music corresponds with his passion for girls. Like sure these things are unrelated, right?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
there.
at the age of 15, he formed his first band, the Conrads, with a K, with school friends. They played local gigs, including weddings and youth gatherings. But Bowie's ambitions went way beyond the confines of his suburban upbringing. He wanted to make a name for himself. Now, he was born in 1947, and we're going to take him to 1962, um, when his life took a dramatic turn. He was involved in a fight with his friend George Underwood. What do you think they were fighting over at that age, Brad?
With their 15,
Something like that. Yeah,
I
15.
mean, gosh, I guess you'd be fighting over a girl, but
Fighting
I don't
over a
know. Yeah,
girl.
yeah,
They
yeah.
both fancied. During the altercation, Underwood punched Bowie in the left eye, causing permanent damage to his pupil.
Damn.
The injury left Bowie with annus acoria, a condition where one pupil remains permanently dilated, giving the appearance of different colored eyes. This striking feature would become one of Bowie's most recognizable traits, adding to his enigmatic persona.
Hmm.
Despite the incident, Bowie and Underwood remained close friends. That's like us. Despite the
Yeah.
incident, we are
The
still
incident.
friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just like me for real. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Underwood would
Can't
later
tell by
contribute.
looking.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Our eyes managed
Our
to
eyes are
survive
fine.
intact.
Yeah, yeah, our eyes are fine. Yeah. And I still need we don't we'll just leave it. And Underwood would later contribute. We don't talk about the incident.
That's right.
And Underwood would later contribute artwork to some of Bowie's album covers. That's cool that he could stay friends with somebody even after
Yeah.
that.
Cool.
I think at some point Bowie may have even thanked him and said, like, to help me stand
No.
out. Like it's,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
that's a very cool, forgiving friend for sure.
Indeed.
I think Bowie knew that he was in the wrong too. I think
Well,
Bowie stole
probably.
the girl, I think is what happened.
Right.
Um, During this period, Bowie's musical journey was filled with challenges. He performed with several bands, including the King Bees, the Manish Boys, and the Lower Third. Man, I am not joining a band called the Manish Boys. I tell you
The
what,
Manish
the
Boys.
Manish
Okay.
Boys,
Yeah.
and the Lower Third, but none achieved commercial success. Bowie's early singles failed to make an impact on the charts, and he struggled to find a musical identity that resonated with audiences. Frustrated but undeterred, he began to explore other artistic avenues, including mime and theater, which he would later
Mm.
that would influence his stage performance. He's the theater guy first. I really think it's helpful to think of Bowie as a theater guy who did music. Uh,
Yeah.
he was a
That makes sense.
songwriter. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've got a little more about early days here from the Dylan Jones oral biography about the early days. Let me crack that open. He studied, and like when I say he studied mime, he went and he studied mime formally
Interesting. Okay.
and would even like perform when I did some theater performances. We'll talk about this. All right, so let's see. This is Bowie himself. Even when I was struggling in the 60s, before I had any success, even before I had a hit record, I wanted to chop and change and do different things. In those days, I was trying to find a voice, trying to find something that worked with people who were buying records, but it was always about change. Cha-cha-cha changes. I wanted to express myself. And who can express themselves if they just do the same thing all the time? Everyone back then was trying to do something different. So why would you want to do something different and then just repeat it? Because then you'd be just like everyone else. And I never wanted to be like everyone else. I think back to some of the material I recorded before Space Oddity, and I know it doesn't fit in with the whole narrative of what I do, but if you look at it through my eyes, then it absolutely does. Because I was exploring a mainstream, almost music hall stream of work. I was being a song and dance man, and I wanted to compete with the Sinatras and the Anthony Newleys of this world. I covered a lot of standards at the time because I wanted to learn how I could do it better than anyone else. He was really serious about being an entertainer, right?
Mm,
I want to
yeah.
entertain people. And he
Right.
was not above, he would even say that like the rock and rollers out of London, had never stepped foot in a music hall in the North. Like there's like a weird kind of class thing going on where he's like, no, I'm a song and dance man. I'm
Mm,
doing, eight numbers and getting off. What's it going to take to win this crowd over, right? Not precious. Like,
right.
how do I win? How do I entertain these people? And I love that about
Right.
him. And
Yeah.
that's a really interesting thing.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
all right, so that's just a little bit about uh let's go on a little bit more. So this is from Tim Hollier, a musician. Eventually, David needed a manager that would take him to the next level, and so he hired Ken Pitt, who is very old school. He moved into Pitt's flat in Manchester Street in June of 1967. So he leaves his house, leaves his home, and moves in with his manager, and started writing novelty songs about bombardiers and gnomes. One of the clubs they would play in was called Middle Earth, right?
Oh,
Like
wow. Okay.
this is that time, right? This is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
counterculture has now become our mainstream culture, but these
Yeah.
guys are the reason why. Um,
Interesting.
David used to say to me, I've got to go and see David Essex tonight, even though I don't want to. I've got to, and I've got to see Cliff Richard. Ken Pitt was sending him to these shows to learn the trade, to learn the stagecraft. So he spent 6 months just concentrating on what he was going to do next, independently of Ken Pitt. I respected the fact Ken was trying to make David a performer, but David didn't like doing it. This is Ken Pitt, his first manager. Initially, I thought that David was someone who could be groomed. I first saw him down the marquee and just loved the way he moved on stage. His songs were actually very good, really outstanding for someone of his age. Here we go. Ken
Okay.
Pitt was in love with David. um,
That's
so I just
that's not
gotta,
a surprise.
nope.
Yeah.
I don't, and this is Wendy Lee. I don't think the affair was ever consummated, and Ken never said it was, but Ken was madly in love with him, and David used that. David could make people fall in love with him. David used to walk around naked in front of Ken when they were living together, so he was almost goading him. The persona that David liked to adopt was the Artful Dodger from Oliver Twist, with a little bit of a boy lost. He did have an amazing body, very lithe with these amazing hips and incredible skin, and David worked it. David was Ken's boy, or at least he always thought so. David even went to see Ken on his last trip. I would be very surprised if he didn't help Ken financially. He only walked away from people when it was cold-blooded professionalism, but he didn't walk away from people he liked. The only one he really walked away from is Mick Ronson. David was a bit sociopathic, but then aren't all stars.
Mhm.
And this is a little bit more about Ken Pitt. Ken Pitt was quite a character. This is hardly Harvey Goldsmith, a promoter. He was flamboyant, an old-fashioned showbiz character, a bit vicious when he needed to be. Essentially, he was in the crossover theatrical world. He and Ken Pitt were like chalk and cheese. He wanted to turn Bowie into a light entertainer, but he didn't really know anything else and didn't understand the rock and roll world. He could handle Manfred Mann or Tommy Steele, Anthony Newley, or Cliff Richard, but not someone like David Bowie. Uh, and this is interesting. Wendy Lee, Bowie was a voice print of Anthony Newley. Anthony Newley's double, really. Anthony Newley was furious. And if you want to listen to some early or some Anthony Newley, you go, oh yeah, he's doing that was sort of what Bowie was doing. Um,
Mm.
and Bowie could turn it on. Bowie could do like a and there are moments where he sings a minute. He sounds like Bob Dylan.
Mm.
He could mimic other people, and he was definitely doing
For sure.
Anthony Newley. Um, all right, a little more about London at the period, and this is Bowie himself. There is an energy about London that never died away, something about the extraordinary mix of people here. I felt it growing up, especially in the 60s when I was trying to get a foothold as a performer, and I feel it whenever I perform here. London is in a perpetual cycle of reinvention, which means as an artist, you can never take it for granted, as the people who like you can be very demanding. When I was writing about the London experience, it was easy to hold up a mirror to what was going on as I was there myself trying to get involved. Um, let's see here. This is fun. And this is Dana Gillespie. Let me see who Dana Gillespie was. I just want to give some context. Dude, if I could go back, I would go back to see the 95 Nine Inch Nails tour.
Mm.
But then I would love to go back and see this period and walk around with David Bowie in London. This is such a
Yeah, for
funny little
sure.
biography for this woman, Dana Gillespie, is a singer and former Bowie consort.
Oh my God.
Like
A consort, eh?
that's the word. That is the word. So let's what she see what she has to say. He would go down, dude, get you some consorts. I'm just saying. That's how you know you're onto something.
Well,
Um, well, but you're a happily married man, aren't you? There
that's right.
in
Yeah,
Michigan, yeah, yeah, yeah.
consort sounds
It sounds like
stressful.
something out of it's. It sounds like something out of like Battlestar Galactica or something. You know what I
Right?
mean? Like it's like Dune. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, I wonder what he thought about Dune. Um,
Mm.
he would go down. He read it. He would
Oh
go
yeah.
down to Carnaby Street and get himself kitted out in a fancy outfit before he was very into his image. Dude, the way I grew up, if anybody ever heard that I went down to Carnaby Street to get myself kitted out in a fancy outfit, I would have had the shit kicked out of me. I would have been thrown into the dumpster, and
Yeah,
deservedly
yeah.
so. Yeah,
Right, right,
it's a
right.
different world.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
oh, I'm going down to Carnaby Street to get fitted out in a fancy
In a
outfit.
fancy
Yeah,
outfit. Yeah.
yeah. You would never see him walking around like a slob. He didn't do slob. Uh, we would sit in the Jaconda Cafe in Tin Pan Alley, Denmark Street, having in Soho, having a cup of tea or showing off. That was the place you would go if you wanted something like a backing singer or a bass guitarist. One time he rushed in and grabbed me by the hand and took me around the corridor to Francis Day and Hunter, which was a music store back then, grabbed me into a tiny booth and said, "Listen to this. It's my first single." And of course it was. I Pity the Fool, which I really liked. And then on the flip side, Take My Tip. Take My Tip? Because I lived in the same place for so many years, David used to come over often. One night he rang up and said, "I've just written a song. I'm coming over in half an hour." And half an hour later, he was at my front door, and I was there with the photographer, Jared Menkowitz. And Jared and I listened to him sing the first version of Space Oddity. How cool is that? In
Mm.
the early days before The Laughing Gnome or Space Oddity, he had been very theatrical, especially when he was with Lindsay Kemp. Lindsay Kemp was the mime woman.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't have said he was a great lead guitarist because he wasn't, and that's it, right? He couldn't play the instruments, but he had enough that he could sing a song. But he was a good strummer, and things went on in his head that he was able to articulate to people around him, and that is an art in itself because he knew exactly what he wanted. He was a great leader.
Mm.
All right, a little more here. Uh, the 60s, and this is Julian Temple, a director. The 60s were a very difficult time for David because he was in the middle of all this frenetic activity, yet he wasn't part of it. It was as though his face was pushed up against the glass and he wanted to see what was going on but couldn't join in. He saw it all happening right before his eyes, but he wasn't there. It was a decade of constant frustration for him as nothing he tried worked. He was reinventing himself every 18 months in an attempt to get some attention, and yet nothing he did appeared to work in any meaningful way. He was an artist, only one who hadn't yet found the right way to express himself. There's a story about him going on I think early before he was huge, at some like club. Somebody brought him along, and it was like a dance club, and he gets up there with his guitar and he starts strumming away, and they boot him off.
Sure.
And the promoter, remembers thinking like, and he may have even gone on stage and said, David Bowie, remember that name. He's going to be huge.
Wow.
So like
Yeah.
he's gathering these people who know that he's a genius, but he's just not, it's not quite clicking yet.
Hmm.
Um, Little bit here from Jason Heller, a writer at Pitchfork. Science fiction legend Robert Heinlein's Starman Jones was published in 1953 when Jones was 6 years old, when Bowie was 6 years old. And the sci fi loving English lad who would grow up to become David Bowie considered it a favorite. Surely he was captivated by the fact that the story's astronautical hero shared his last name, and that with a bit of imagination, he might someday become his own kind of Starman Jones. During the formative years of the mid 60s, Bowie was the frontman of a short lived group named the Lower Third, and that rock band incorporated an odd choice of songs into their repertoire. Mars, the Bringer of War, a movement from the planets, the orchestral suite by the English composer Gustav Holst. The suite was known to British audiences of Bowie's generation, primarily from its use as the theme to the popular Quartermass science fiction serials produced by the BBC in the
Mhm.
50s. We know Bowie was a huge fan, once admitting
Yeah.
that as a boy he would watch it from behind the sofa. So there you go. Uh, as the amphetamine fueled mod scene morphed into, he was a mod, morphed into the acid fueled psychedelic scene, London became the laboratory in which Bowie began conducting experiments of his own, ones that sought to transmute science fiction and fantasy into the sounds of popular music. Like most of his pre Space Odyssey output, Bowie's 1967 song Karma Man made little impact on the public consciousness. The song, however, vividly depicts a tattooed man whose elaborate body art tells wondrous and hideous tales. 1967 also saw the release of The Laughing Gnome, a novelty song, a single that had been dismissed by many Bowie fans as fluff. It's a curious song, a pastiche of singer Anthony Newley's silly music hall style, sped up voices, and a bizarre retro Victorian vibe. It sounds awesome, but it also taps into a newfound cultural fascination with mythic creatures like gnomes, elves, and goblins, thanks in large part to the late six. Well, he would play the Goblin King in,
Yeah,
which
that's
traumatized
true.
me.
Oh
I,
yeah,
I
yeah.
couldn't I couldn't do Bowie for such a long time because pubescent Kevin in
Yeah.
little Mandan, North Dakota, they wheeled in. It was like must have been the end of the school year, and they wheel in friggin' TV into the class. And what are we going to watch? I
Yeah.
guess we're going to watch Labyrinth. Here's David
Yeah.
Bowie's big giant cod piece on
I was
this
gonna mention the
on
cod
this little
piece.
screen. I'm surrounded by other teenagers. It was very true, like
Yeah.
actually mildly traumatizing.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
really,
No,
really disliked it. I was like, that's that guy? Fuck
that
that
was
guy.
our generation, like for a lot of us, that's our first exposure to David Bowie is as the Goblin. Is
And they tell
it
you,
from Labyrinth.
and they tell you that MK Ultra ended, man.
Yeah,
Never
yeah. And
ended.
it's he is creepy. He's very, very creepy in that movie.
Well, and and we're going to come up to this with the spiders and everything. The influence for that was, if you had to guess, what movie influenced the look of Ziggy and Star and the spiders and all the rest.
Oh
Just
gosh, I don't know. I come in before. I mean, because I was what, 71, 72.
mhm.
Gosh, I don't know. I was gonna say Star Trek.
Think that's what everybody says, but think
Yeah.
codpiece. Think codpiece.
Oh, who's got a codpiece before that? Shakespeare adaptations?
Clockwork Orange.
Oh, right, right, right.
They were
Yeah,
dressing up like a gang from a Clockwork
yeah,
Orange. All right.
yeah.
And they
Okay,
were a
okay.
gang,
Yeah,
they're a
yeah.
fancy boy, rock and roll gang. Yeah. Um yeah. Okay. So people are getting into gnomes, elves, and goblins thanks in large part to a late 60s resurgence of interest in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Maybe you've heard of it. Originally
Mhm.
published in the mid 50s, as well as its predecessor, The Hobbit from
Mhm.
1937.
Yeah,
But
we're
unlike
always we're permanently into goblins and orcs and trolls and things now. Like sort of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Many of us are trolls.
Yeah, that's right.
Many of our fans are trolls.
Yeah, that's right.
Many of our listeners are trolls. They desperately want you in the Discord, Brad. I'm just telling you.
Oh
People
my
want you
God.
in there. One day, we're gonna throw a little event. We're gonna drag you in there. Yeah, it's gonna
Yeah.
be good. And the Discord is fun. We've got a little group of people in there. We've got different channels. I got a channel devoted to pens. I have one
Hey.
channel that's like our conspiracy channel. It's just called Tunnels.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
If you
Yeah,
want to,
that
you have
that's the
anything
one that might draw me in.
that we
Yeah.
need you to
Yeah.
come to talk about the
Yeah.
Tunnels
Yeah.
chat. We could even set it up so that you're only in the Tunnels channel, Brad. That
I
would be
might have to do that. I'm just,
Brad. I know.
I have so many. Well, anyway, yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yeah. You're telling me I need to download another
I,
app?
yeah, and I'm becoming slightly digitally agoraphobic. So,
I understand. I understand.
yeah,
Well, in any
yeah,
case, if you want to join the Discord, it's at artofdarkpod.com
yeah.
slash Discord. All right. Um, let's see here. But unlike the earnest appropriation of hobbits and elves that had begun to pop up in folk and progressive rock in the late 60s, Bowie's emerging style pointed more toward the future rather than the past, and not in an optimistic way. Here's Paul McCartney for the first time.
Hey,
I have fond memories of David in the 60s where I used to live in London and still live actually. And I was bachelor free then. And it was a bit like a salon in my house. Anyone could drop in just to hang out. Anyway, there was this young boy lying about, hanging around outside. And I said, come on in then. I invited everyone in. And it was a guy in a floppy cap with curly hair. And I said, who are you? And he said, David Jones, Davy Jones. And he had a demo for me. He played me the demo. And I thought, that's really good, I must admit. I thought his voice was a little like Anthony Newley with the same kind of similarities, you know? But I thought he was great. A very personable, cool guy. I wished him well. All right. Okay. So
okay,
he's tramping around London, hanging out with, Paul,
Paul
meeting Paul.
McCartney.
It's pretty
Yeah,
cool. Yep.
yeah.
So in 1966, Bowie adopted his stage name to avoid confusion with Davy Jones and the Monkees. The name Bowie was inspired, and it's Bowie. That's how he said it, was inspired by the American frontiersman Jim Bowie and his famous knife. And the knife, that name might be pronounced differently, but it's David Bowie.
Yeah, a lot of people
Uh,
say it's a Bowie knife, but
okay,
yeah,
Bowie knife, David Bowie.
right.
Yeah, both of them will cut you.
Nah.
Yeah. This marked the beginning of Bowie's transformation from a struggling musician into one of the most innovative and influential artists of all time. All right, and I've got a link here. This is from dangerousminds.net, and this is a bit about a theater production he did in 1968. David Bowie and Lindsay Kemp's rarely seen production, Perot in Turquoise. Do you know anything about Perot,
No,
Brad?
no,
Pierrot.
I
Perot
don't.
is a
No.
stock character of pantomime and commedia dell'arte whose origins are in the late 17th century Italian troupe of players performing in Paris, Paris, and known as the Commedia Italienne. The name is a diminutive of Pierre, right? So it's like Little Peter, Perot,
Hmm.
Little
Hmm.
Weed, Little Peter.
Yeah, yeah,
Little Peter shot Little Weed.
yeah.
Uh, right. And so it's like you can look it up. It's a stock character from like the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, from the great theatrical past. And it's like it's the everyman. Okay, and Bowie even shows up here, right? So Perot's character developed from being a buffoon to an avatar of the disenfranchised. That's us. Many
Yeah.
culture, that's us. That's the Art of Darkness podcast. Many
You
cultural
can take
movements.
the buffoon out of the Perot, but you can never take the
Uh,
Perot out of the buffoon.
you can take the
That's what I
buffoon
always
out of the
say.
circus.
Yeah.
Yeah, the carnival.
Mhm.
Many cultural movements found him amenable to their respective causes. Decadence turned him into a disillusioned foe of idealism. Symbolists saw him as a lonely fellow sufferer. Modernists made him into a silent, alienated observer of the mysteries of the human condition. Much of the mythic quality, I'm Perot, said David Bowie, I'm everyman, still adheres to
Mm.
the sad clown in the postmodern era. This is kind of like a proto-Beckettian figure almost, this sort of
Yeah.
sad everyman
Interesting.
trope
So he's making
archetype.
this play when he's like uh, 20, I guess,
It
something
was
like that.
in on the 28th of December 1967, David Bowie made his theatrical debut
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
Oxford New Theatre in Lindsay Kemp's mime Perot in Turquoise, or The Looking Glass Murders. Bowie wrote and
Huh.
performed the music. He also starred as Cloud alongside Kemp's Perot and others. The
Pretty
production was
pretty
still,
high concept,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
kind of.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, David Bowie is the definition of art rock,
Hmm.
art pop. Pop. It's
Hmm.
Bowie is the highest of the high and the lowest of the low, which doesn't necessarily make it middlebrow, right? But
No.
he could also just write a straight up stadium rock banger, right? And like anthemic music like Heroes, which I'm going to talk about.
Mhm.
If you haven't listened to Heroes in a while, man, I beg you to go.
Yeah.
If you don't listen to any song, after this, go and listen to Heroes. If I ever feel too down or whatever, like that is a go-to. That is a go-to
Mm.
song. That has everything. I got to go to Berlin. I got to go to Berlin to where they recorded that and go. I don't know if the wall's still there or if that part's been torn down, but that song is
Mm.
like, and that's another thing that I neglected to write into this outline, but I might just Google it on the fly as we go. Um,
Mm.
I mean, that song's everything. In any case,
Yeah.
um, the production was still in rehearsal when it played for its one night at the New Theater, which perhaps explains why the Oxford Mail described the show as something of a potpourri, though it highlighted Bowie's contribution for praise. David Bowie has composed some haunting songs, which he sings in a superb, dreamlike voice, but beguilingly as he plays Cloud, and vigorously as Jack Burkett mimes Harlequin. The pantomime isn't a completely satisfactory framework for some of the items from his repertoire that Mr. Kemp, who plays Perot, chooses to present. No doubt these are, and it sounds like Lindsay Kemp is a dude. Um, no doubt these are shortcomings. Yeah, if I was named Lindsay, I wouldn't have survived elementary school. No doubt
That's right.
these are shortcomings. Mr. Kemp will attend to before he presents Pearl and Turquoise at the Prague Festival at the invitation of Marceau and Fielka next summer. No mean honor for an English mime troupe. Okay, so yeah. All right, there's a little more here. Bowie's career throughout the 60s exemplifies Thomas Edison's adage genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. As the young, hopeful musician worked hard and toured the length and breadth of the UK under various guises the Conrads, the Hookers. You heard that right, the Hookers. Davy Jones and the King Bees, the Manish Boys. The blues influenced Davy Jones and the Lower Third, Davy Jones and the Buzz, and the Riot Squad, a band described as the complete musical entertainers covering pop, tableau, burlesque, and parody. I mean, so
Huh.
he's just like doing all of this, right? Um, it was during this time Bowie fell under the influence of mime artist and performer Lindsay Kemp. He helped Bowie channel his talents towards Space Oddity and later Ziggy Stardust, as Kemp told journalist Mick Brown for Crawdaddy in 1974. I taught David to free his body. Even before meeting, David and I had felt the need to work together. I'd identified myself with his songs, and he'd seen my performances and identified himself with my songs. I was singing the songs of my life with my body. He was singing the songs of his life with very fabulously with his voice. And we reckoned that by putting the two together, the audience couldn't help but be enthralled. In other words, one large gin is very nice, but two large gins are even nicer. All right. So he collaborates with this fellow, Lindsay Kemp. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a little bit more about what's going on in his family and in his personal life with his brother. And uh, this is from the Daily Mail. So take it with a large Daily Mail grain of salt. Mm. All right. So there's a movie came out. I think it got blasted. Stardust, new biopic. I don't think it did very well.
Oh, yeah.
We haven't had a Bowie biopic. Really, not really.
Yeah. They gotta
Maybe
they
one.
gotta they gotta stop just doing these off the shelf cookie cutter biopics it's embarrassing,
It
honestly.
it is pretty cringy.
Yeah.
And it's Bowie's life was his own biopic, right?
Mm,
That's why Moon Age Daydream is great. I
mm.
would say if you watch one piece of Bowie media, watch Moon Age Daydream. And that's streaming online now. That's very good.
Right. I've never seen that.
Yeah, that's worth watching. Uh, right. So, uh, spurned by Bowie's family. Well, no, this is about Duncan Jones. I actually want to. We'll talk about Duncan. Um, The movie touches on how Bowie's relationship with his schizophrenic older half brother Terry Burns shaped his career and ultimately influenced the creation of his onstage persona, um, Ziggy Stardust. So, and apparently the film focuses on that business. Um, and yeah, a lot of people did not want to see this movie. So here, as the Mail discovered this week, it was Terry who first introduced Bowie to West End clubs and music, to thought-provoking books by Jack Kerouac and Albert Camus, and to the jazz and soul records that ultimately fired his imagination. Bowie himself readily acknowledged Terry's influence, saying that from him he got the greatest serviceable education that I could have had. He just introduced me to the outside things. I saw the magic, and I caught the enthusiasm for it because of his enthusiasm for it. And I kind of wanted to be like him. Listen, all of us need that older brother, that uncle, that older cousin, that guy, that friend from school who's a couple years ahead of you who throws those books into your hands. Everybody needs that. That reminds me, I got a bunch of books on the shelf here, and there's some my teenage daughter. We went and saw Alice Cooper, and oh, Brad, you're muted. We went and we saw Alice
Cool.
Cooper. Yeah, Alice Cooper. Who is coming up alongside Bowie, who was just a little bit ahead of him. They mentioned Alice Cooper in some of the interviews. Dude, the
Well,
funniest thing happened to
similar kind of guys in a
well, all right,
way.
because we're
Yeah.
doing theatrical, yeah, but he's doing
Right.
the horror shtick. Bowie was kind of doing
Right.
the sci-fi, and then Bowie invented glam rock essentially.
Hmm.
But dude, Alice Cooper, if you get a chance to go see Alice Cooper, by the way, strongly recommend doing it.
Right on.
I gotta tell a little anecdote that's so funny. I started posting Alice Cooper stuff from the show, and I'm in this chat with this boomer Vietnam veteran, the sort of local friends here in Minnesota, and I'm posting Alice Cooper. And you remember the Wayne's World scene, we're not worthy,
No,
and the
yeah.
whole business about, Milwaukee and the very,
Yeah.
very well-spoken Alice Cooper.
Right,
Um,
right.
the dude in my chat, the Vietnam vet, he's like, "Oh yeah, Alice. I played golf with Alice in Palm Springs for 7 years. He's a great golfer." I'm like, "What the hell? It's real.
I've
It's
heard
all
that he was,
real."
yeah,
Yeah,
I've heard he was a great golfer before. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It's a shtick,
So
you know.
yeah, yeah. Oh no, he knows what he's doing. I guess somebody said he has a PhD.
Oh,
Uh, I could be
let me look
nonsense. No,
that
no,
up.
he
Let me
does.
look
Well,
that up.
he has honorary
Oh,
doctorates. But I
well.
mean, that's
Yeah.
still cool.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Um, yeah. Oh, dude, I'm on the Alice Cooper Wikipedia. That was legitimately the most fun I've had at a rock and roll show. Full
Really
stop. It was just so
cool,
much
man.
fun. Yeah, and his band they just crush, and he still
Yeah.
does the thing where he gets his guillotined, and and it's just wild, man. It's a trip. Okay, but this isn't the Alice Cooper episode, so let's talk a little more about Terry. Um, uh, but Bowie also spoke of the mental illness that dogged his mother's side of the family and his fear of succumbing to it, as his half brother did. Um, and so at some point, this is a bit about Terry. Terry Burns was a well known, somewhat scruffy character at the mental hospital that he was interred in, wandering the corridors, begging cigarettes from porters, and borrowing money from nurses to buy alcohol, telling them his brother was the famous pop singer David Bowie, and he would pay them back when the star eventually found time to visit him. That's rather sad.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Bowie wouldn't go to visit him when he was put in the asylum. Um, Only a handful of patients and staff knew that his seemingly fantastical claim was true. Some of them had glimpsed Bowie when he came to visit Terry at Cane Hill in the early 70s. And there was a time when Bowie and Angie organized picnics for him at the hospital grounds or took him away to spend weekends with them at their apartment in Haddon Hall, South London. Others had seen the postcards Bowie sent Terry while he was touring around the world, some of which surfaced on eBay last year. All
Hmm.
right, so that's just, I think I've got a little bit more about Terry here on from the oral biography. Let me make sure I get it. I want to make sure that I get this right. Oh wait, wrong page. Always so much to navigate. Here we go. I'm going to
Hmm.
move my light a little bit here as well. Brad,
Yeah.
let me
Well, you're
jiggle
killing
that
it
so
here,
I can.
Kevin.
Oh, good.
This
I'm
is
glad
good
you're
stuff.
are you having a good time?
Oh yeah.
I hope everybody's having a good time. This one was so much fun. And again, like in another life, you just become one of those obsessives and you say, "Oh, I'm going to just we're doing the David Bowie podcast now, and
Right.
that's it." you
Yeah.
know, in another world. I mean, you know, and what's funny is you could arrive at Art of Darkness just by doing the David Bowie podcast because it's just a sea of names, and one thing connects you to
Right,
the next
right,
thing, and another thing connects you to the next thing, and before you know it, you're doing an episode about the Marquis de Sade behind the paywall
right,
because it
right,
influenced Arthur
right, right,
Rimbaud, who influenced Jim Morrison, who
right,
met
right.
whatever.
Yeah, no, I see what
It's
you mean.
it's
Yeah,
all connected. Yeah.
it's all
Um,
connected.
as Terry was 11 years older than his half brother, he would show David around London when he was around himself, that is, introducing him to the dive bars and flesh pots of the West End, immersing him in the world of jazz. He wasn't around much, but when he was the dominant sibling. As a way to reciprocate, in February of 67, Bowie took Terry to his first rock concert to see Cream at the
Mm,
Bromley Club in Bromley, or the Brommel Club in Bromley. The
mm,
rock world was alien to Terry, and the gig had a colossal effect on him. They were walking home, and suddenly Terry started behaving in an extremely strange fashion. It was as though he were having a vision. He saw the road opening up. He saw fire in the cracks in the road, and he went down onto all fours, trying to hold the road, saying that he was being sucked off into the skies from the earth. Bowie had never seen anyone in that kind of metaphysical change before, and it scared the hell out of him. These attacks would happen again. Chislehurst Caves are not far from Bromley. Cut from Cretaceous chalk, they were apparently built by the Druids.
mm.
Ah, at least according to legend. The
Whoa.
Druids, nobody knows who they were or what they were doing, but their legacy lives on, hewn into the living rock of Stonehenge. The Druids. Spinal Tap, right? Spinal
Spinal
Tap.
Tap people. Yeah.
Yeah. During the, I just hewn into the living
You
rock
need to do
of Stonehenge.
so good.
Yeah. During the First World War, they were used to store ammunition, and during the Second World War, used as an air raid shelter, a big one. By the 60s, bands that started performing there, flattered by the fact that they were actually underground. Tunnels.
Mhm, mhm.
Susie Sue, who hailed from Bromley, said they used to freak her out. They were very dangerous, she says. They used to cordon off bits you couldn't go down. Kids would sometimes go down there and get caved in. This is where Terry Burns ended up one day in 1967 when he turned up at his Aunt Pat's house in Bromley where he was living, only to find that they'd suddenly moved to Australia. As he tended to go AWOL, Pat and her husband had no way of letting him know, so he went wandering, ending up in the caves where he stayed for 8 days straight.
Wow.
When the police eventually found him, he was taken briefly to David's home before being taken back to Cane Hill Asylum, a place that would become something of a home away from home. All right.
Jeez.
So
Oof.
yeah, we're not talking about oh he's awkward and tough to be around. He's like
Right.
seeing the road crack open after a
Right.
rock and roll show
But
and
it was
living
Cream that kicked this
true,
off.
true. Right, the band Cream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is wild.
With
I
fair
mean,
enough.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, rock and roll is still a new technology. Like
Yeah.
as far
Yeah.
as technologies go, rock and roll is newer than the light bulb,
Right.
right?
Right.
So
So you never know what side effects it's going to have.
absolutely, really.